Welcome to the Creating an Accessible Newmarket training module. Through this program, you will learn about the many ways that the town of Newmarket is making its programs, services, and facilities accessible for people with disabilities. This training is a requirement of Ontario's Integrated Accessibility Regulation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. What is this training module about? This module will provide an overview of how the town of Newmarket is taking steps to create an accessible community while ensuring we meet the province's legislative accessibility standards. You will learn why accessibility is important for everyone and about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA, which is the legislation that drives accessibility in Ontario. We will review Newmarket's accessibility policies that direct our efforts to meet the legislative requirements. The second part of this training module will introduce the Ontario Human Rights Code and how it relates to people with disabilities. The Code and the AODA work together to create an equitable and accessible Ontario. Ensuring that everyone has access to the services they need is important. Yet many people with disabilities face barriers to these services every day. Did you know that currently 1 in 7 people, or 1.85 million Ontarians, have a disability? This will be 1 in 5 by 2036. This represents 15.5% of Ontario's population. As the population ages, it is expected that the number of Ontarians with a disability will grow. In this training module, we will define accessibility as the degree of ease that something can be used and enjoyed by a person with a disability. From a broader perspective, though, an accessible Ontario helps everyone participate more fully. An automatic door helps someone carrying packages or pushing a stroller, just as much as someone in a wheelchair. Accessibility benefits everyone so that all people may have equitable access to town programs, goods, services, and facilities in a way that respects their dignity and independence.
Making accessible communities is also the law. In 2005, Ontario passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA, with the goal to make Ontario fully accessible by 2025. The AODA outlines accessibility standards that Ontario organizations and businesses need to follow to identify, remove, and prevent barriers so that people with disabilities have more opportunities to participate in everyday life. The Accessibility Standards for Customer Service Regulation was the first standard to become law. It strives to make customer service operations of organizations accessible to people with disabilities. Included in that standard is the requirement for all staff to be trained on how to provide accessible customer service. The next regulation to become law is the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. This regulation addresses accessibility opportunities related to the information and communications, employment, transportation, and standards for design of public spaces. This regulation also includes general requirements, one of which is training you are receiving today. All of these requirements under the regulation are being phased in over time to 2021.
This provincial act comes to life at the local level through the adoption of policies to direct organizational activities. The town of Newmarket adopted the Accessibility Standards for Customer Service in 2009. The Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or IASR, policy was adopted in 2013 as a requirement of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. The IASR policy includes the requirements related to information and communications, employment, and transportation. These policies guide the work we do towards making Newmarket services and facilities accessible for everyone while meeting the province's requirements. The Integrated Accessibility Standard Policy affirms our commitment to meeting the accessibility needs of people with disabilities in a timely and proactive manner so that all people may have equitable access to Town of Newmarket programs, goods, services, and facilities in a way that respects their dignity and independence. The town is committed to creating an open, welcoming, engaging community where all people can benefit from the same services and opportunities. Now, let's look at this commitment and how it translates into the work we do. We strive to offer accessible customer service to all residents. The mandatory accessible customer service training that all of us have received has helped us best meet the needs of our customers with disabilities. You may recall the phrase, "How may I best help you?" It reinforces our commitment to ask our customers with disabilities how they would like to be assisted without making assumptions. This statement helps demonstrate our commitment to respecting the dignity and independence of people with disabilities. Newmarket is committed to using accessibility criteria and features when procuring or acquiring goods, services, and facilities. Newmarket will ensure that training is provided on the requirements of the accessibility standards referred to in the regulations and the Ontario Human Rights Code. We will retain and maintain a record of training provided which will include dates and the number of people trained. Agents and service or facility providers are also required to have the AODA training. The Act requires that we provide mechanisms for people to give us feedback on how accessible our services and facilities are. Our policies ensure that we will notify the public of a variety of accessible formats and communication supports.
According to Statistics Canada, Ontarians with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. The AODA has standards to help people with disabilities to participate in the labor force and employers to find skilled talent. For someone with a disability, a barrier in the workplace could be a process or a tool used to get the job done. Solutions are often simple. For example, during recruitment, a job applicant with a learning disability may request that interview questions be provided on paper for better comprehension. These practices are built on obligations we already honor under the Ontario Human Rights Code.
According to Statistics Canada, Ontarians with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. The AODA has standards to help people with disabilities to participate in the labor force and employers find skilled talent. For someone with a disability, a barrier in the workplace could be a process or tool used to get a job done. Solutions are often simple. For example, during recruitment, a job applicant with a learning disability may request that interview questions be provided on paper for better comprehension. These practices are built on obligations we already honor under Ontario's Human Rights Code. The AODA standards work to make public transportation more accessible for everyone. For Newmarket, this means working with our Accessibility Advisory Committee, persons with disabilities, and the public to determine appropriate levels of accessible taxi service within the community, as well as ensuring that additional fees or fares are not charged for persons with disabilities than for persons without disabilities for the same trip, including the storage of mobility aids or assistive devices. York Region provides accessible public transportation services through York Region Transit Viva and Mobility Plus. This is an example of how regional and local municipal governments work together to provide accessible services within our community and province. Today you have learned how Newmarket's accessibility policies create an accessible Newmarket. The Town of Newmarket offers accessible customer service, has a 5-year accessibility plan, places an accessibility lens on purchases and acquisitions, trains employees, volunteers, vendors, service providers, and members of council on the importance of accessibility and implementing the AODA. Also makes the way we communicate accessible, makes websites and web content accessible, creates an accessible work environment, partners with the region and vendors to make public transportation accessible, and makes buildings and public spaces accessible to everyone. Why accessibility? Yes, it is the law, but more importantly, accessibility means giving everyone, people of all abilities, the opportunity to participate fully in our community. Accessibility benefits everyone. You have now completed the first half of this training module. In the second half, you will learn about how the Ontario Human Rights Code and the AODA work together to promote an accessible Ontario. Welcome to part 2 of this training module. In this segment, you will learn about how the Ontario Human Rights Code and AODA work together to create an accessible Ontario. The Ontario Human Rights Code is a provincial law that provides equal rights and opportunities for all people without discrimination. There are 15 grounds of discrimination under the Code, including disability. The Code protects people from disabilities from discrimination. The following series of 5 short videos has been produced by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The first video offers an introduction to the Ontario Human Rights Code and how it relates to Ontario's accessibility requirements.
Welcome to Working Together, training on the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. We'll show you how the code applies to people with disabilities and about your organization's duty to accommodate. We'll call the Ontario Human Rights Code the Code, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA, and the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, the IASR. They're all laws you must follow. This module describes your organization's rights and responsibilities under the Code and the AODA standards, as well as how they work together. The IASR under the AODA requires training about the Code and how it helps people with disabilities. This module provides that training. The Code has primacy. This means that Ontario laws, with a few exceptions, have to follow the Code. Its goal is to provide for equal rights so as to create a climate of respect where everyone feels part of the community and can contribute fully. The Code says people with disabilities must be free from discrimination where they work, live, and receive services, and their needs must be accommodated. The goal of the AODA is for Ontario to be accessible by 2025 by removing and preventing barriers so that people with disabilities can participate more fully in communities. As part of the AODA, the Government of Ontario is developing and enforcing mandatory province-wide accessibility standards in key areas of daily life. The first regulation under the AODA was the Customer Service Standard. The next standards, Information and Communications, Employment, Transportation, and Design of Public Spaces, are contained in one regulation called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or IASR for short. The Code and the AODA work together in various ways to promote equality and accessibility. The Code has primacy. It overrides the AODA and other provincial laws when there is a conflict. In fact, the AODA states that if there's a conflict between it and any other act or regulation, the law offering the higher level of accessibility comes first. The Code and the AODA are both provincial laws and both use the same definition of disability. They don't apply to the federal government and federally regulated organizations like banks, airlines, and interprovincial transportation companies. These are covered by the Canadian Human Rights Act. While the Code and the AODA work together, they have some important differences. Under the Code, when a person with a disability needs accommodation, there is a duty to accommodate. This means organizations may need to provide an individualized response to an accommodation request. The Code applies to all Ontario organizations, regardless of type and size. This includes owner-operator organizations without employees, It also covers volunteers and unpaid workers. The AODA sets accessibility standards that organizations must meet. The human rights principles of the code help to inform and guide how AODA standards are to be met. The AODA standards apply to all organizations, public, private, and not-for-profit, with one or more employees in Ontario. Requirements depend on an organization's type and size. The AODA standards don't limit or replace the requirements of the code or any other law. Meeting AODA standards doesn't guarantee that an organization has met code requirements or that the organization won't receive human rights complaints, but it may lower the risk of complaints.
In the second video, you will learn about the protection that the Ontario Human Rights Code offers people with disabilities.
The code offers protection of rights, equal opportunity, and freedom from discrimination. It applies to jobs, housing, and services, and states that employers, landlords, and service providers must accommodate people with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. Employers must accommodate employees when they cannot perform all of the duties of the job because of their disabilities. For example, suppose an employee with low vision has a job requiring her to work on a computer. Accommodating her needs might include supplying appropriate computer technology. Accommodation means not denying people jobs or services in the first place if they can be accommodated to the point of undue hardship. Changes may be required to an organization's policies and practices or staff training so that discrimination doesn't recur. The code is not meant to punish. When discrimination happens, the goal is to fix the situation to provide equal opportunity for the person with a disability. The code promotes educating and working with organizations to make changes that prevent discrimination and harassment. Many people think of disabilities as noticeable physical disabilities, such as someone using a wheelchair. But not all disabilities are visible, and you can't always tell who has a disability. In the code, disabilities can include physical limitations, mental health, cognitive or intellectual development, learning, hearing, or vision. They also can include epilepsy, substance addictions, environmental sensitivities, and workplace injuries. The code protects people from discrimination and harassment because of past, present, or perceived disabilities. Disability itself is not a barrier, but barriers exist that can exclude people with disabilities. These include physical barriers, information and communication barriers, systemic barriers, or attitudinal barriers. Barriers to accessibility prevent people with disabilities from fully taking part in the social and economic life of our communities. Physical barriers include things like providing steps, but no ramps or elevators. Information and communication barriers can make it difficult for people to receive or give information, such as using unclear language or print that's too small. Systemic barriers can result from stereotypes or established practices, such as inflexible work hours that don't coordinate with paratransit bus schedules. And attitude can be the biggest barrier. Ableism is a tendency to see people with disabilities as less worthy, underestimating their potential, or excluding them from decisions that affect them. Organizations should try to identify and remove barriers before problems arise, instead of waiting to answer individual accommodation requests or complaints. You can also avoid creating barriers altogether through inclusive planning and design. For example, when setting up a new website, design it for people who have sight and hearing disabilities.
Accommodating the individual needs of people with disabilities is a legal requirement under the Code. Understanding the duty to accommodate is the topic of the third video.
Accommodating the individual needs of people with disabilities is a legal duty under the Code. This allows people to benefit equally and take part fully in the workplace, housing, and other services. The most appropriate accommodation is the one that best meets the individual needs of the person with a disability. You're only exempt if it would cause undue hardship, a very high test. There is no set formula for accommodation. Some accommodations can benefit many people, but what works for one person may not work for others. You must consider individual needs each time a person asks to be accommodated. Many accommodations can be made easily and inexpensively, but if it's not possible to put the best solution in place, or if doing so results in undue hardship, you still have the duty to take the next best steps. Examples of accommodation include providing printed material in alternative formats, such as electronic files, large print, or braille. Providing sign language interpreters or real-time captioning for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Offering flexible work hours or break times. Modifying job duties, retraining, or offering alternative work. Installing automatic door openers and accessible washrooms. Accommodation doesn't have to be provided if it causes undue hardship. Undue hardship is the legal limit of the duty to accommodate. It refers to situations where severe negative effects outweigh the benefit of providing accommodation. 3 factors are used to determine undue hardship. 1. Costs. Renovating an older building to make it accessible may be too costly for a small business. If the business must reduce staff or hours to provide the accommodation, then it may be able to claim undue hardship. 2. Are there external funding sources, such as grants or tax breaks, to reduce the accommodation costs? And 3. Health and safety considerations. For example, there may be undue hardship if the accommodation violates occupational health and safety regulations. Employers must try to keep all workers safe and still accommodate the needs of the worker with a disability. If a significant risk remains for others, it will be undue hardship. If a significant risk remains only for the worker with a disability, they might have the right to accept the risk. The courts have set a very high standard of proof. You must provide clear evidence if you are claiming undue hardship. Employers have a duty to accommodate the employee as fully and as promptly as possible in his or her job. Modifying job duties might be appropriate in some cases. If accommodation in the original job isn't possible or would cause undue hardship, consider other available jobs or retraining opportunities that could accommodate the employee in another job. You may be held liable if your organization fails to take steps over time to accommodate employee needs. Everyone involved must take part in the accommodation process. Sometimes outside experts can help too. If you need an accommodation, tell your employer, union, landlord, or service provider about any needs related to your disability and your job duties, tenancy, or the services being provided. Provide supporting information about your disability-related needs, including medical or other expert opinions where required. Get involved in seeking accommodation solutions to the best of your ability. An employer, union, landlord, or service provider must accept requests for accommodation in good faith. Act promptly, even if it means creating a temporary solution before a long-term one can be put in place. Ask only for information needed to provide the accommodation. For example, you may need to know that someone with vision loss is unable to read printed material, but not how or why she lost her vision. Actively seek appropriate accommodation solutions and ask for expert help if needed. Cooperate with other parties where necessary. Respect the dignity and privacy of the person asking for accommodation, and make sure the accommodation process doesn't lead to reprisals against that person. Cover the costs of accommodation, such as any needed medical or other expert opinions or documents, to the point of undue hardship.
Organizations should follow human rights principles and the Ontario Human Rights Code obligations when interpreting Ontario's accessibility standards. Applying these human rights principles is the topic of the fourth video.
Organizations should follow human rights principles and code obligations when implementing the AODA standards. Keep these points in mind. Don't create new barriers. Don't make changes to facilities, services, goods, technology, or procedures that reinforce or create new barriers. Design inclusively. Make choices that work for as many people as possible, especially those with disabilities, while meeting individual needs. Favor integration over segregation. Usually, the best accommodations allow people with disabilities to participate in similar ways with everyone else. Equal outcomes sometimes require different treatment. Different or separate accommodations may be necessary to help people do their jobs or access services. Involve those who need accommodations in exploring solutions. They often know what works best for them. Make sure the process and solutions meet the individual's needs and promote privacy, dignity, and respect. And spread out accessibility costs. People with disabilities should not face extra costs for accommodations they need to do their job or to receive a service. Accessibility should be factored in as part of the overall cost of doing business. The Code and AODA accessibility standards are laws that work together to promote equality and accessibility in Ontario. Under the Code, employers must consider disability-related accommodation requests and provide timely accommodation from recruiting and hiring through to retirement or dismissal. The employment standard of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation builds on these requirements. Organizations must set up processes to address employee accommodation needs at all stages of their employment. Except for small organizations, employers must have a written process to document an employee's accommodation needs in an individual accommodation plan. This important step helps ensure that all the necessary people are involved, the right steps are taken, and the best possible solutions are considered and put in place. The Information and Communication Standard, the Transportation Standard, and the Design of Public Spaces Standard of the IASR also complement the Code's duty to accommodate requirement. As you implement the accessibility standards, please keep in mind the Code principles and requirements you've learned in this training.
What happens if someone with a disability believes that an organization or person has failed to meet their disability-related needs? The fifth and final video in our training module is about compliance with the law and how it is enforced.
Understanding and applying human rights principles may help avoid potential human rights complaints and litigation. Ontario has 3 organizations in the human rights system: the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and the Human Rights Legal Support Centre. The Human Rights Commission provides policies, guidelines, and other information on code grounds, including disability and the duty to accommodate. The Human Rights Tribunal hears discrimination claims called applications on any code ground. This includes claims from individuals who believe an organization or person has failed to accommodate disability-related needs. The Human Rights Legal Support Center helps people through the human rights process, such as completing an application or claim to the tribunal. Individuals cannot file accessibility complaints under the AODA, but in cases of non-compliance, the Directorate can enforce standards through mechanisms set under the law. Meanwhile, the Accessibility Directorate works with organizations having trouble meeting the standards in order to bring them into compliance. Today, you've learned how the Ontario Human Rights Code applies to people with disabilities and about your legal duty to accommodate. Let's recap some key learning points. The Code and the AODA are laws that work together. The Code protects every person's right to equal opportunities and to be free from discrimination. The Code has primacy, which means that Ontario laws, with a few exceptions, have to follow the Code. You also learned how the AODA accessibility standards complement the Code to promote equality and accessibility in Ontario. The AODA uses the same definition of disability as the Code. If the two conflict, then the Code prevails. Applying human rights principles and Code obligations may help in meeting the AODA standards. The AODA standards do not replace or limit the Code or any other law. Congratulations, you've met the training requirement on the Code as set under Section 7 of the IASR.
Let's review a couple of important points to remember about the Code as it relates to people with disabilities. The Human Rights Code works with the AODA to promote equality and accessibility in Ontario. The Code provides equal rights for all people so that everyone can feel a part of the community and be able to fully contribute and participate. It protects people with disabilities from discrimination where they work, live, and receive services. It has primacy over other Ontario laws, including the AODA, so that if the two laws conflict, the Code will prevail. And the Code states that legal duty of employers, landlords, and service providers to accommodate people with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. Accommodating the needs of anyone who wants to use our programs, services, or facilities is the right thing to do.
The town is committed to meeting the accessibility needs of people with disabilities and to creating an accessible town of Newmarket. By implementing our accessibility policies and taking steps ensure that our processes, services, goods, and facilities are accessible, we will achieve this goal. We will be able to do this by working together, and this training module showed us how. We explored how the town is implementing the province's accessibility standards and the core accessibility principles behind the work we do. We have also examined the role of the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to people with disabilities. Most of all, we have a better understanding of the importance of making Newmarket accessible for everyone, for people, for businesses, for the community, and for all of us. For more information about creating an accessible town of Newmarket or accessibility-related training opportunities, please contact the Town of Newmarket Accessibility Coordinator at 905-895-5193. Together, we can create an accessible Newmarket.